Good evening from the News Radio 1120 and 93.7 FM KPNW studios. I'm JoJo, the Circus Boy, a.k.a. Bill London. I host the Wake Up Call Monday through Friday morning, 6 a.m. to 9 on KPNW. And today's crazy news brought to you by none other than Rick Dancer. Yes, Rick Dancer. For great tires and also good hamburgers, you know where to go. Rick brings you the news because, well, there's stuff that you don't get to hear about that you probably should. All right, here's a look at some of the stories we're following. Well, first off, the Oregon Court of Appeals is allowing ballot measure 114, the most extreme anti-gun measure in the nation's history, to move forward. It requires, among other things, a gun safety course with live fire training to get a permit to just apply for a gun. It creates an entire new set of red tape to even get a gun. It goes, you have to get also a background check by the FBI and spend a couple of $100 every year just to own a permit to buy a gun. It prevents a gun transfer if a background check by the Oregon State Police takes more than 3 days, which was enshrined in Oregon law. It also limits magazine capacity to 10 rounds. It would also limit the types of guns that you can buy, and among other things, it also would increase the age of individuals before they could even own a gun. There's also other things that are a part of that particular piece of Oregon law or ballot measure that go along with other controls on guns. Now, in the Court of Appeals ruling, which was deciding if ballot measure 114 held muster under the Oregon Constitution, they wrote, and listen to this, that the constitutionality of a law as enacted is rarely, if ever, dependent upon facts. And that's how they decided this particular case. Now, challengers say they're going to appeal the decision to the Oregon Supreme Court, although that is likely a moot point because the Democratic supermajority in the Oregon legislature is already moving on an omnibus bill to implement Measure 114's rules through legislation and increase them. And the governor has already said, you pass it, I'll sign it. As to the court decision yesterday, for now, the rule does not take effect immediately. That's because the court remands it back to the lower court, which was in Harney County, so that they can reverse their ruling based on the Court of Appeals ruling, which will likely take several months. But again, the Oregon legislature may well enact House Bill 3075 prior to that particular decision. Keep in mind, there is another lawsuit against ballot measure 114 that is moving through the federal courts, saying that it's a violation of the U.S. Constitution, and in particular, the Second Amendment. So who knows where this is going to go. Well, the Secretary of State's office finally removed a very controversial cannabis industry audit from the website hosted by the Secretary of State's office. Now, at the time, researchers were looking into the need for modernization of Oregon's cannabis laws to help, get it, grow the state's economy. But it was later revealed that then Secretary of State Shemia Fagan, who oversaw the audits division, was secretly moonlighting as a consultant for the marijuana industry, in particular and specifically the legally challenged and tax evading LaModa pot chain, owned in part by personal friend of Shemia Fagan, Rosa Cesares. Okay, now going back, and we reported this and have been for the last 2 years on these broadcasts, that Fagan, as Secretary of State, secretly was receiving $10,000 a month from LaModa as a consultancy fee. And she said, after she was outed by the media, well, I need to do this because I'm only making $80,000 a year as Secretary of State, and I need the money because the salary is so low. Let's all feel sad. A subsequent Oregon Department of Justice investigation, including a determination by an independent consulting firm that found that repeated communications between Fagan and LaMotta and Rosa Cesaris and the audit team completely undermined the independence of the audit. Now, as a matter of fact, LaMotta and Rosa Cesaris specifically were telling Fagan what they wanted to have in the audit and how things need to be changed to, well, shall we say, give them more money. Now, according to the Oregon Justice Department, and I'll read from their findings, quote, given the known threat to the independence of the audit organization, the Oregon Secretary of State's office, and the impact the perception of this threat has had on the OLCC audit report, we recommend that the Secretary of State pull the audit report from the publicly accessible website and provide additional and accurate audit work. But, of course, Fagan, for her part, resigned in shame in 2023 over the scandal. But then Secretary of State LaVon Griffin-Vilade, whom Governor Kotek named to serve as the interim Secretary of State for the remainder of Fagan's term, she declined to take the tainted audit down. Fagan, for her part, like I said, resigned. Now, current Secretary of State Tobias Reed has decided to scrap the whole thing, issuing a statement saying that protecting the integrity of the Audits Division and ensuring audit standards are rigorously adhered to is the responsibility of leadership. He says, I do not believe the prior management of the audit functions of the Secretary of State's office lived up to the obvious and unambiguous responsibility. He also said that a number of demands were made by the Justice Department saying that they needed to change a variety of things within the Secretary of State's office. And Reed said none of those things, or at least very few of them, were ever done, which he also reiterated that he plans to incorporate. He said, I'm glad to bring this process to a conclusion that demonstrates a commitment to audit standards and common sense. By the way, Reed, after he took office, replaced all of Fagan's and Griffin-Vilade's election and audit directors. All right, we've talked a lot about Oregon's Wildfire Hazard Map, and it looks like it is dead. And that is according to the guy whose idea it was to create the map to begin with. Speaking at a joint town hall with Republican Senator Noah Robinson, Ashland Democratic Senator Jeff Golden, a Democrat, told the crowd at a town hall that or at least he said, quote, with a very high level of confidence, I can tell you we are repealing the Wildfire Hazard Map entirely. He further stated that the second go of the risk map, he said, when you still walk the properties, they just don't make sense. Now, a second version of the Wildfire Hazard Map was released in January, and it ranked properties across the state as low, moderate, or high hazard, and marked whether or not they were in what's called the wildland-urban interface, where populated areas are close to some form of vegetation. That map also met with strong opposition, especially in rural areas where a large percentage of the properties were categorized as high hazard. That same map was also going to be used as a basis for Senate Bill 79 that's currently being debated by the legislature that would literally ban you from building a home on property that you own or replacing a home that was lost through maybe fire, storms, or otherwise in those so-called wildland urban interfaces. In other words, taking away your property rights. Robinson, for his part, introduced a bill to repeal the entirety of Senate Bill 762 that created the Wildfire Hazard Maps. Now, he did say something interesting. He said there were certain parts of Senate Bill 76 that actually were okay and were helpful, like, for instance, funding for cameras used to detect smoke throughout the state and various fire suppression programs. But he said, let's repeal ballot measure 762 and take the things that were working and address them individually. He stated bluntly that politically, the fire map is the problem, and a lot of legislators now realize it was a mistake. So as ICE continues to round up and deport illegal aliens and immigrants to this country with green cards who have violated the nation's laws, well, an arrest from the other side of the country, from Oregon, and a potential deportation has riled students at the University of Oregon, and they have rallied on campus and have had protests. The arrest and threat to deport a Columbia University graduate student for protesting in support of Hamas and Palestinians has students, of course, calling for his release. Activist students and likely non-activist students or non-student agitators rallied this week outside of Johnson Hall on the U of O campus. They were protesting on behalf of Mahmoud Khalil of Columbia University. Now, he's a Palestinian immigrant with a green card, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents arrested him over the weekend, and he's awaiting to learn whether he's going to be deported or allowed to stay in the U.S. The protesters at the University of Oregon, whom nobody nationally is paying attention to, say that it's not just immigrant students who need protection. Okay? The protesters say locally that students have been targeted through the University of Oregon's Code of Conduct process, and they have been threatened with suspension or expulsion. Well, the reason for that was after illegal activities on the U of O campus from last year, like anti-Semitic vandalism, protests, encampments where they're not supposed to be, and anti-Semitic events on the campus. And that was all part of pro-Palestinian and, in some cases, open pro-Hamas activities on the U of O campus. But the U of O students claim they're experiencing repression from the administration regarding their protected free speech, which apparently includes things in their mind like anti-Semitism and, of course, spray painting the sides of buildings. Of course, like at campuses all over the country, many of those protests were led by non-students and out-of-state activists. The White House said this week that Khalil had been distributing Hamas propaganda. On Monday, though, a federal judge blocked Khalil's deportation while it considers a lawsuit challenging his detention. So, kind of on the same lines, as protests in Oregon ramp up because of the Trump administration, a court ruling here in the state has squelched police from videoing them. Now, the Oregon Court of Appeals upheld an earlier ruling that it is illegal for Oregon police to live stream a protest for any reason other than to document a crime in progress. Now, that raises questions whether other recordings at protests violate Oregon law. You see, a lot of cities retain large amounts of protest footage for the possibility of civil cases, like, for instance, the footage from last spring's protests at Portland State University. You remember the one at Portland State University where protesters did $1 million worth of damage to the school's library? After 2 contentious weeks, school board members in Woodburn, where 87% of the students are Latino, reversed themselves and supported a resolution expressing support for the privacy rights of immigrants and refugee students, regardless of whether they're here in the country legally or not. Now, the reversal passed on a 3-1 vote with the board chair abstaining. And it came after 2 hours of furious and angry testimony castigating the board for rejecting that same resolution at their previous board meeting on February 25th. Now, on the 25th, 3 of 5 board members voted against the resolution because they needed more information about whether it would jeopardize their federal funding for the school district, as the Trump administration has threatened school funding for school districts that are hiding or at least protecting illegal immigrants into the country. Well, once again, the Oregon Democratic-led legislature here in the state wants to take away Oregonians' voice. There are 2 bills that had a reading on Wednesday: House Joint Resolution 11 and House Joint Resolution 3. Both of them aim to limit and reduce people from using the petition initiative process that is enshrined in the Oregon Constitution. Now, House Joint Resolution 11 raises the number of signature requirements to qualify a measure to the ballot by about 35%. House Joint Resolution 3 takes it, well, a lot further by requiring a prospective petition to get a threshold of signatures from each of the 36 counties in the state. Now, here's the way initiative petitions currently work in Oregon. You have an initiative petition. You have to go out and collect a number of registered voters based on people who voted in the last election for governor. Right now, that's 6% of essentially the people who voted in the last election for governor. You have to get 6% of that number. And you can collect them from anywhere in the state. If you wanted to, you could get all of the signatures just from the Portland area, or you hit the major cities in the state. Well, House Joint Resolution 3 requires it to be 6% from every county in the state who voted in the last general election, which nearly everyone believes would be an impossible task. Liberal Democratic lawmakers are all about it, along with the unions who fund most of the Democratic campaigns here in the state and others of their supporters because of the long list of past tax cutting and anti-crime measures that Oregon voters put on the ballot themselves. And right now, what they want to do is block voters from the democratic process. And of course, by doing that, it ensures that, as we talked about earlier, that the House bill that would essentially enact Anti-Gun Measure 114, well, Oregonians couldn't put it on the ballot for a vote. So, furthermore, House Joint 3's power would make it illegal for non-Oregonians to financially support an initiative petition ballot, either to go out and get petitions or support it or oppose it in any way if it actually made it on the ballot, which is kind of interesting because much of the money, for instance, that's come for gun control advocates here in the state of Oregon has gone to Oregon legislators from mostly out-of-state interests. backed by Michael Bloomberg from New York State. Now, it wouldn't ban that from legislators getting money from out of state, but it would block the measures done by initiative petition that are on the ballot or trying to get on the ballot of using out of state money. Kind of fun. The huge drop in citizen-led and grassroots petition drives that we've seen in the past is a direct result of Democratic politicians who have been picking away at the initiative process here in Oregon to make it harder. And they have done that through a variety of ways, including through administrative rules that have been enacted by the Secretary of State's office. Under these two bills in particular, it would not only make gathering signatures and getting enough signatures more difficult, but in the case of House Joint Resolution 3, it would make it almost impossible. That means that the only petitions that you would see on an Oregon ballot would be put there by Democrats in the Oregon legislature. Welcome to Oregon. Also, just in case you wanted to know how Oregonians feel about taxes, pretty much fed up. That according to a poll of 500 registered voters done by Public Opinion Strategies research firm. They say the accuracy is about 4%, plus or minus either way. Not that it makes a difference. Because 79% of Oregonians, according to this survey, favor lowering income taxes. 70% favor eliminating any state income tax on tips and overtime pay, and 56% just overall think taxes are too high. 38% think, well, they're about right, and 2% say they need to be higher. Now, here's kind of what makes this important, or at least notable. Right now, Oregon's Democratic legislators are considering a variety of new taxes and fees to fund increases in Oregon's failing and flailing education system, which, as we've documented here, is nearly the worst in the nation, and also for a big new fat budget for the Oregon Department of Transportation that just in the last year and a half made a $1.1 billion accounting error. The triangulation then remains: how much can lawmakers raise taxes before they revolt, either through an initiative process that we just told you they want to limit, or just by finally voting differently? Who knows? All right. Tonight's crazy news brought to you by none other than Rick Dancer. Rick Dancer Hair Products. When your hair needs to stand up on end, go see Rick. All right, time to roll out your industrial-sized can of reel, Rick.